There are few television shows more famous, more important historically than All in the Family. You've either seen the show or you've grown up seeing clips of the show. You know about Archie and Edith Bunker and some of the drama that takes place, the important issues that get tackled during this show. Well, we wanted to talk about this television show on this podcast today. And we brought in this amazing scholar, a brand new friend of mine, Oscar Winberg. I say this because he just told me how to pronounce his name correctly in Finnish. You might pronounce it Oscar Winberg as well, but he just wrote a brand new book coming out through UNC Press called Archie Bunker for President: How One Television Show Remade American Politics. And I just finished talking with him about 10 seconds ago. And we have a really amazing discussion talking about the formation of All in the Family, the difficult topics it tackled, the Nixon administration's responses to it, and the legacy all the way to today, including contemporary American politics. It is a really fun, great conversation talking about the show that so many of us know and really putting it into context. It's this incredible political moment in time as well. So I hope you enjoy this conversation because Archie Bunker for President is next on Reckoning with Jason Herbert. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning. Okay, so I guess I should probably ask you. You're in Finland now, is that correct?
Yes.
The big question I have maybe to start the day is, what's it like to be in a country with a fully functioning government? I don't know what this is like anymore.
I mean, being in the Nordics at the moment feels great, but it also, looking at the U.S., makes even right-wing governments in Finland seem fairly great in terms of still respecting most democratic norms and so forth.
Yeah, the history books that like my podcast, I will not be around long enough, and the podcast will not be around long enough to have all the histories written of these like 12 years of weirdness that we've got going on here in the U.S. People conceptualize it, but your book that we're going to talk about today very much gets into it, actually. So stick around if you're listening, because we'll dive into our current era. There's no escaping it today, but. Before we do all of that, Oscar, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you're doing here?
Sure. So officially, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Turku Institute for Advanced Studies and the John Morton Center for North American Studies at the University of Turku. That's a pretty big and mouthful to get that out. But amongst friends, I was to say that I'm a political historian working on modern U.S. politics and media and how they intersect.
Are you from the U.S. originally?
No, I'm from Finland.
Okay, so what drew you to the United States? To like, why? This is fascinating to me because I actually write indigenous history myself, and I'm not native, and I'm always fascinated by folks who are like, oh, well, let me study something outside maybe my own experience or something like that. Why United States? Why American culture, American political history?
Well, I think really this goes back to sort of those coming of age years. So I'm a millennial, and 9/11 and that sort of period after 9/11 was my teen years and late teen years, and it was very clear, even from Finland, it was very clear that if you're interested in sort of power, if you're interested in understanding world politics, the U.S. is the major player. And so that sort of made it a very natural pull to be interested in understanding the U.S.
You know, the cool thing that you do with this book is come at American politics from this completely different angle, which is interesting because I was thinking about the book as I was reading it last night. and kind of reflecting on it last night over dinner and thinking about, this podcast itself initially started off as a film podcast, talking kind of exclusively about film and pop culture. And it's all the dynamics that come with it. And in so many different ways, this book really perfectly encapsulates the power of pop culture, the intersections of pop culture and politics, how those things unite, and then how, once combined, once those powers come, like Captain Planet combined, really kind of start to shape American political culture, in the 30, 40, 50 years since then. So I actually told my mom about your book yesterday. I was like, Mom, did you watch this show? She's like, oh yeah, absolutely. Because I'm late Gen X. I'm born in 77. So my mom was a teenager when the show was on. And so we got to talking about this stuff and so forth. And it was really interesting to hear her commentary on the show and then kind of align that with your own thoughts. So but I guess let's not bury the lead too much. Why you wrote a book on Archie Bunker and All in the Family? Why, of all the things, Oscar, why this show? You could have picked that. Any show in the 70s, if you MASH is sitting right there. Why this show?
Well, I sometimes say that, the writers, the producers, the actors on All in the Family were really my first U.S. history professors, in the sense of, in the 1990s in Finland, a new commercial network started up, and to get content for afternoons, they bought these old U.S. rerun shows, and All in the Family was one of those shows that I spent a lot of time coming home from school as a teenager, watching, and sort of what you said about your mother. My parents had watched that show when it aired originally in Finland as well. So there was that sort of connection of, afternoons watching the show, and then during the dinner table being like, hey, let's talk about the Vietnam War. Let's talk about Nixon, about inflation, all of these topics that came up in the show and weren't necessarily, as a Finnish teenager, something that you were thinking about in your day-to-day life or even recognized as phenomenons. Redlining, for example, is a theme that comes up in multiple episodes. So All in the Family in that way was important to me and sort of played into that whole dynamic of the US as well. But when I started out, it wasn't supposed to be just All in the Family. When I started my dissertation, I wasn't even thinking that All in the Family was going to be the main factor. But then I just kept noticing that All in the Family is really the driver here. We can talk about different shows. MASH is one example, but also later in the 70s, popular shows are less political in the sort of concrete or narrow definition of political. I'm talking about Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, Three's Company, these kind of shows. But even then, you could trace back All in the Family opened the doors or introduced the new methods that they were able to use when they wanted to engage with controversy or politics.
Yeah, and I don't, we'll get into this a little bit later in the pod, but it's so after reading the book, it starts to become apparent to me that so many shows in, say, the late 70s into the 80s are either kind of carrying on, borrowing from All in Family, or a reaction to, in some of the cases as well. I got to thinking about Family Ties as well, and the political dynamics of that, and how it's a more lighthearted show in so many in different ways, but it's also talking about politics and baby boomers and all of these different things. And all of a sudden, this book, it gives me this really cool lens to start to I'm thinking about the Cosby Show all of a sudden, right? After this, and boy, all the weight that carries with that now. Let's go back though, if we can, because I think a lot of people think about the show and they think obviously about Archie Bunker, and they think, oh wow, this guy was a standout dude in so many different ways. He was so different. Right. And I think that's one of the things that your book really points out is no, wait, this show is different. This was a radical departure in 1971. Can you talk a little bit about how this show kind of comes to be? What Norman Lear is trying to do with this? Was there pushback? Because this is so different than anything else I've been seen before. Are we lucky to even get this on air?
Yes, very, very much so.
Hi, Charlie.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just talking to your dog.
Okay.
So he's great.
Yeah, you can hear him in the background.
This is Oscar's dog, Charlie. Go on.
So All in the Family is based on a British show. But British shows, we're talking BBC in the 1960s, it's not the same as the US. Well, you still get this just to a certain degree in terms of the BBC and shows over there where they run for 12 episodes over 4 years or something like that.
Right.
But it is the talk of the town in the UK in the mid 60s. And so what happens at that point is that Norman Lear has this production company with a producer and director called Bud Yorkin. And he's over in the UK making a movie. And so he's in London. He hears these conversations and he's talking to Norman Lear back in California and says, this could never, describes the show, the dynamic between a bigoted, sort of reactionary father-in-law and his son-in-law living with him, and he says this could never get on the air, and talks about the differences between the British context of television, where also, of course, we're talking public service versus a commercial system. But Norman Lear, in these conversations, he's like, no, I recognize that dynamic between the father-in-law, the father figure, and he goes back to his own relationship with his father. And so he starts to think about, maybe we should make this in the US. And many people are saying that this just, it won't get on the air. You can't do a show like this. But Lear and Yorkin go about securing the rights for the show. And after that, they sell it they pitch it as a pilot, get funding to do a pilot for ABC. And this is really back in the day when it was a 3-network industry. So you have CBS, NBC, and ABC. And the critical part here is that ABC is the perennial loser, right? So they're running far behind. And so when the programming people at ABC see this pilot, they're like, this is actually, it has legs. This is something new. We want to do this. And they introduce it to the higher ups at the network. And the higher ups are just like, we're going to pretend you never showed this. Like, this is a disaster. Because it's so bold. It's something new. And ABC is, or at least the executives at ABC think they're not in a position to sort of push the envelope, to experiment, do something new, because they're the perennial losers, right? And so instead of just kicking it, the programming people say, you know what, make another pilot with the same script, but new casting in terms of, they actually keep the sort of older generation. So Gene Stapleton playing Edith Bunker and Carol O'Connor playing Archie Bunker are the same, but they changed the kids, the daughter and the son-in-law, and they make a new pilot, and ABC is still saying, we're not really, we don't have the sort of capital, the pull to pull this off. And so when that happens, Norman Lear, Bud Yorkin end up almost by chance having a meeting with programming heads at CBS, which is the #1 network, the Tiffany network, as they labeled themselves. And they're saying, this is actually what we need at this moment, because we need new stuff, and we need shows that will reach a new segment. So being #1 is great, but the shows on CBS were shows like, Red Skelton or Green Acres, Andy Griffith, these very popular shows, but their demographic profile was reaching out to the broad audience. And network executives at this moment were recognizing that they actually want shows in the major media markets with young, affluent people who will be the key demographic for advertisers. So it comes to CBS, but then there's still this fight between programming executives and higher ups about, should we actually take a chance on this? And I think the key the key difference between CBS and ABC, beyond sort of their position in the hierarchy of television at this moment, is that the new president of CBS Television, Robert Wood, has come in from the owned and operated stations. So he has been in charge of the CBS stations in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. So exactly those media markets that they want to rejuvenate with new programming. So he's betting his career on All in the Family. And that's the long story of how something as controversial as this actually gets on the air.
There's a fascinating story here. These counterfactuals of like what happens if ABC doesn't make this true. But if ABC takes this show, maybe they just don't allow it to become what it becomes. Because as you point out during the book, this show really starts to take some big swings at some huge societal issues, and we're going to get into why that happens in a bit. But I'm kind of wondering before we do that, like, Oscar, what's the landscape in American television prior to All in the Family? Because it certainly feels, after reading this, that you can really draw a real hard line in the sand between everything before and after All in the Family. Like, what's on TV prior to this?
So prior to All in the Family, there are some shows that sort of want to push the envelope a little bit. You have the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, for example, that is pushing, anti-establishment, anti-war messages into their variety show. They end up getting canceled for that. You have Star Trek, which sort of again pushes a little bit on conventions and especially in terms of race and gender roles, tries to push the envelope a little. And you have stuff like Julia, which also is a show about a black woman. So you have some of this, and perhaps the Mod Squad is another example of this. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. So you have Green Acres, you have the Andy Griffith Show, you have Petticoat Junction, a lot of these rural shows. You also have still high-ranked shows with sort of the stars of yesteryear, if you will. Lucille Ball has a show on. It's no longer I Love Lucy, it's Here's Lucy. You have Jackie Gleason from The Honeymooners still around doing shows. Ed Sullivan is doing his variety. So it's not exactly, and then you have these escapists, Gilligan's Island, in the 60s, there's even a show called Mr. Ed, which is about a talking horse.
Remember.
And there's one show about, I think it's called something like My Mom is the Car, or it's a confusing pitch, but the main character's mother comes alive in his car in some form of way. You've got The Flying Nun, this escapist fare, and we're talking now about the 60s. So, there are American cities burning, there are American soldiers in Southeast Asia getting killed on a daily basis. None of that is front and center when you turn on your television at night. More perhaps just in Huntley Brinkley and the Walter Cronkite Evening News, but beyond that, you won't really get a connection to real life, and that is sort of the big shift when All in the Family comes in. That it sort of pulls the curtain back and shows you real people, so to speak.
Can we talk a little bit? You showed this, and there's some really interesting graphics inside the book here that talk about this, but can we talk about how big the show was? Because you see like the introduction of the show, and then it immediately, Oscar, explodes. You talk about there's really 3 channels in the United States at this point. Can we talk about like the idea of this show becoming appointment television?
Yes. And it is appointment television even before that sort of phrase is popularized. And this is key, I think, at least when I'm talking to students nowadays. I sort of recognize that talking about television, we need to sort of historicize and contextualize what this means. What does it mean that a show is big? Because we don't have that anymore. I looked up the highest rated show last year for our conversation here, and it was Sunday Night Football, and then Tracker at number 2. I don't know if you watched Tracker, but it's unfamiliar to me.
I've seen it. It's like in Alaska.
Okay.
Right?
But this, my point here really is that, nowadays, if we go through the top rated shows, I guess at a dinner table in the US, most people won't have watched the same shows. In the 1970s, in the 1960s, this is very different because you only have the 3 options, right? That's first of all, in terms of high quality productions. You've got local channels as well, but when we're talking about really pulling audiences, we're talking about 3 or 2.5, because ABC is that far behind at this point. So that means you've got a bigger segment for each show, first of all. But the other thing is, we're talking about an era where most people are watching television without remote controls, right? So you really settle in with a network, a channel at the start of the evening, and then you watch whatever comes next. And this is called at the time the least objectionable programming theory, that the point isn't to make the best shows. The point is to make shows that won't force anybody in the couch to get up and change the channel because they find something objectionable. But so All in the Family sort of changes that dynamic, or sort of puts holes in the theory of least objectionable programming. But that's beside the point here. The main point is, this is water cooler stuff. You come to work and you can stand at the water cooler and you know that everybody's watched the show last night. This is also prior to home recording. It's prior to cable breaking through, obviously prior to streaming or anything like that. So you need to watch the show when it's on the air, or you have to wait potentially months for reruns. Not even to mention syndication, which is years down the line. And so what I found really interesting when doing this work is how much All in the Family, as the number 1 show, is present in everyday life. So you will find, not only bumper stickers and sort of buttons and T-shirts with phrases or characters from All in the Family, but you will find Archie Bunker in like Superman comics, Mad Magazine, all over the place. There's records produced, books written about like the funniest things Archie and Edith and the gang say. And it explodes in the 1970s. And it's really, you can't go about day-to-day life in the U.S. without being aware of the show. And in fact, there's a poll in the mid-1970s that finds that Archie Bunker is the most recognized face in the nation. So when we're talking about like it being a big television show, it's really quite unimaginable almost from present day context to understand this. And I'm here talking, even if we take a wider view of present day, we think prior to streaming, prior to TikTok and everything taking over, even like the 1990s, Seinfeld, Friends, they had a rating of like 20, whereas All in the Family was pushing 33, 34 in its heyday. So it really is a quarter or more of the population watching on a regular basis.
Yeah, I am fascinated by this on so many different things. The aesthetics of this, Oscar, you and I both grew up in a post-MTV universe where the visual appeal of television stars becomes so important. And Carroll O'Connor, God bless him, not the most handsome man. So it's amazing to think, he's almost the Van Morrison in some ways. Like, this is a guy not really built for television. And then he becomes quite literally, as you're saying, the very face of television for so long. But I want to ask you here, we've been kind of hinting at the idea that this show was revolutionary in so many different ways because of the heavy things that it's talking about. And I kind of want to ask you a two-part question maybe you can kind of build on here, which is All in the Family really, as we look at it 50 some odd years later, is revolutionary in the way, in the things that it's talking about. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the big heavy issues that it does address and kind of sets it apart. But also, was that always the goal? Was there an agenda to really, going into to make this show, it's like, hey, we're going to talk about, assault, or we're going to talk about bigotry or homosexuality, or, through this character. So I guess that's my question. Was it always intention to be like this thing where we're gonna go after these big picture things that are in the United States right now?
Yes, very much so. And that's why it was so controversial to get it on the air, because the idea, and this is very explicit, Norman Lear is telling his writers, I want you to come to work as fathers, as husbands, as people dealing with issues, and take your own stories. And he provides the writers' rooms with the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and sort of encourage them to find the stuff that they want to talk about from real life. And this is sort of the major departure from previous programming and the least objectionable programming theory that I mentioned earlier. So even if you look at just the first season, which is half a season, it comes in as a mid-season replacement in January 1971. You've got residential segregation, you've got homosexuality, Richard Nixon. There's discussion about miscarriage, about feminism or women's liberation, as it's called at the time, economic downturn and hardship. This is really the idea: is that we're going to talk about the stuff that hasn't been talked about before. And the funny thing I might bring in here is that the people doing this, they're all veterans of television. So Norman Lear himself wrote for Martin and Lewis in the 1950s, for the Colgate Comedy Hour, for Tennessee Ernie Ford, and his writers as well. They work with Bob Hope and Jack Benny and figures like this. So these are seasoned veterans who know what they haven't been able to say on television before. And now they're coming in with the blessing of Norman Lear that, what we're now going to do? Now we're going to talk about those things that actually matter.
Are there episodes, Oscar? I have to imagine you probably watched so much of this show and all of the spinoffs and so forth. The legacy of this is insane. Yeah. But when we talk about these things, are there particular episodes that our listeners should really, if someone's coming, it's like, wait, well, what episode should I watch here? Are there particular episodes that kind of pop into your mind? Or this is All in the Family. This, in a nutshell, is really where we need to be talking about. That gives us a good demonstration of what this show did and how it did it.
So in terms of individual episodes, usually what people will recognize is Sammy Davis Jr. visiting. Yes. The family. But that's really an exception in a sense of Sammy Davis himself sort of forced him up on the show by doing interviews saying that he's going to guest star in a future episode before having made any such arrangement with the producers. So he sort of forced their hands, and it's something that stands out because of that. Because it's straining that reality thing, right? To have Sammy Davis Jr. playing himself in the bunker household. But that is the one famous that people will know. For me, I think some of the other iconic shows, beyond the pilot, which was really something that Norman Lear fought a lot with the networks about, because he said that you need to get wet at the beginning, and that jumping in the pool is what the pilot is intended to do. So showing the characters and sort of the 360 of the characters from the get-go. So that's always the best starting point. But there are these really sort of iconic episodes, some of them coming later on from season 7, for example. There's an episode called The Draft Dodger. So this is I think 77, and it's an Thanksgiving episode, where Archie has a friend over for Thanksgiving. The friend has lost a son in Vietnam, and at the same dinner, his son-in-law, Mike, or as Archie calls him, Meathead, is also bringing a friend over, and that friend is a draft dodger who spent his years during the war in Canada. And so this conflict then erupts, with Archie being upset about the idea of having a draft dodger at his Thanksgiving table. And in the end, the sort of the Gold Star father says, you know what, actually, he would have liked his son to have been spared. And he is happy to break bread with this draft dodger because they both see the folly of the war. And again, let's put this in the context. This is prior to Apocalypse Now or The Deer Hunter, these films that start to deal with the Vietnam War. So it's a pretty early conversation, an open conversation about that war. And you have this moment where Archie erupts and doesn't want to hear about the goddamn war and stuff like this. So it's a very, very iconic episode, and in fact is one of the episodes that Jimmy Kimmel and Norman Lear remade some years ago for a live remake that they did on ABC. And then the other, and I talk about this episode in some detail in the book, is also a late episode from season 8. It's a two-parter called Edith's 50th Birthday. And this is one of those very powerful shows. It's about Edith turning 50, but whilst the rest of the family is preparing for a surprise party next door, she mistakenly lets in what she thinks is a police officer who's really a rapist. And there's the first part is this tense struggle of Edith trying to get away from the sexual assault. And then the second episode, which came about because the production company worked with experts on sexual assault and sort of recognized that we need to deal with the aftermath here as well, is about Edith's the emotional toll and questions about reporting and working with the police and so forth. So that's another one of these like big shows. If you watch documentary on the 1970s, you might see clips from this episode. And I do get into some detail about that background work of how that episode came about and how political that process was. So I would say those, but if you're asking for a favorite episode of mine that, gets at that everyday spirit of All in the Family, there's a show called Edith Finds an Old Man from season 4, which is an excellent encapsulation of the show. There are political fights. There's a political message about the care of the aging in the U.S. And in fact, Senator Frank Church uses it then as the chairman of the Committee on the Aging in the Senate and has broadcast or airings of it to his colleagues. So that's also a lesser known, but for me, a really good starting point.
We live in an age now where a TV show takes off and we immediately see copycats. And I'm kind of wondering, Oscar, did the same thing happen? Because this show was so revolutionary. Did stations like ABC go, wait a second, we need our own All in the Family? Were there other attempts to kind of clone this show on other series? I think we can talk here about Maude and later on Jeffersons and so forth, right? Or to kind of spin off of the success here. Like, what's the immediate effect commercially of the success? How does this spin off immediately?
So from the get-go, of course, television is a business of imitation. So you've got the other networks looking at, like, how do we do this? What's the special sauce? And it sort of becomes this conversation about relevance. Like, how do we do relevant programming? And I should mention that the Mary Tyler Moore Show comes on a couple of months before All in the Family. So and that's also CBS. So CBS is in this strong position. The first sign of this is that Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin are pitching a new project, also a British show that they are adapting. They're calling it Sanford and Son. In the UK, it was Steptoe and Son, if I'm not mistaken. And CBS is sort of lukewarm about coming to the pitch meetings and paying attention to this. So they actually sell it to NBC. And the NBC people, it's sort of a funny story because they come and watch it on a sound stage at CBS, and they sell it from inside the building. And that sort of annoys executives at CBS, and they are determined from that point onwards that any Tandem Productions, and Tandem is the independent production company of Lear and Yorkins, they're going to buy them. So that's where you then get Maude, which is a direct spin-off of All in the Family, and then Good Times, which is a spin-off of Maude, and then The Jeffersons, which is also a spin-off of All in the Family. But also other shows. Norman Lear in the 1970s does One Day at a Time, which is fairly successful. He does less successful stuff like The Hot L Baltimore, and then revolutionizes the sort of the daytime syndicated soap with Mary Hartman. So a lot of this stays in the CBS family, but you also see other networks. Some examples would be Chico and the Man, sort of trying to get to that relevance and sort of the ethnic appeal. You also get Welcome Back, Kotter in the mid-1970s, and Barney Miller on ABC is another example of trying to push the envelope in terms of relevance and sort of reality on the shows.
You brought up Jimmy Kimmel earlier today, and I feel like now this becomes super relevant, especially to because of what happens to Jimmy Kimmel quite recently. And I'm kind of wondering, all of this is going on. Most of this was going on during the Nixon administration. As you talk about, Nixon did not like this show. Nixon didn't really seem to get the joke for most things, which makes maybe Nixon the butt of many jokes. But how does the Nixon administration through the FCC respond to All in the Family?
Okay, so there's a lot of interesting stories in this and how Nixon relates to this. And I think to make the connection to Jimmy Kimmel and the suspension under government pressure of Kimmel's show earlier this fall, to make that really poignant, we need to recognize that one of Nixon's very close friends is actually a Hollywood producer, Paul Keyes. And he's sort of, I don't want to say forgotten, but there's not a lot about his relationship to Nixon in the history books. But he is the person who convinces Nixon to do Laugh-In in the 1968 election, right? Where you have that short cameo by Nixon where he says, "Sock it to me." That's because Paul Keyes is the producer of Laugh-In. And so when it comes to All in the Family, when Nixon first sees it, he hates it. And there's this famous rant on the Nixon tapes, the White House tapes, where he's talking to Haldeman, and he's fuming because the show he's seen is a season 1 episode called "Judging Books by Covers," and it's about homosexuality. And Nixon is furious and talks about, this is how you destroy the morality of societies and so forth. And he rants and raves about this show. And there's an interesting part of that conversation where it's clear that Haldeman has been watching. Nixon sees it because he's trying to watch a baseball match, but it's rained out. So a rerun of All in the Family comes on. But Haldeman sort of has a better sense of the show. He talks about it, describing Archie as the hard hat, which is obviously the political shorthand for these working class men for Nixon, the silent majority, if you will. And the curious thing about this is that Haldeman runs point in the White House in terms of satire and comedies and attempts to ridicule Nixon and his base. And you, in fact, have this previous sort of adventure where Nixon is convinced by Haldeman and his producer buddy Paul Keyes that what is being done on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour is hurting the U.S. Or to be more direct, is hurting Nixon's view of what the U.S. should be. And so Haldeman and Keyes together sort of help get the Smothers Brothers canceled and off the air. So you have this awareness of this can be dangerous, right? We need to pay attention to pop culture. We need to pay attention to television entertainment. That's a given in the Nixon White House. But then if you look beyond that famous conversation where Nixon is ranting and raving about All in the Family, they return to it later. And at that point, he's very excitedly telling this story about All in the Family to a wider circle of his aides, including Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, where he says that Paul Keyes out in Hollywood has sort of convinced him that what is happening with All in the Family is that they thought they were going to make fun of Nixon, make fun of Archie Bunker, but Nixon has become convinced that it's backfiring. And in fact, people love Archie Bunker and thus sort of loves his politics. So Nixon comes to see All in the Family as something that might benefit him politically. And you even have at one point Haldeman in the Nixon tapes saying that this is the best ad that they could have for the 1972 election. And so when the election is heating up, Nixon tries to lean on his friends in Hollywood to get Carroll O'Connor to endorse him as Archie Bunker. So his idea is, prior to the election, you get Archie in the White House, shaking hands with the president and endorsing Richard Nixon. So whatever you might say about Nixon, he was very savvy in terms of the media and how to make that work for him. And it comes to nothing, of course, because Carroll O'Connor is a very liberal person and sort of hates the politics that Nixon is driving. And we can talk a little bit about how Carroll O'Connor becomes engaged in the election, but it's not to support Nixon. And then the other part of this story is later on, Nixon first appoints Dean Birch to the FCC, who is sort of this Goldwater loyalist, but then later on, to succeed him, he appoints a man called Richard Wiley, who was previously counsel at the FCC. And Wiley, when he comes in as the FCC chair, this is no longer during Nixon's presidency, but he comes under pressure not from the White House, but from Congress, that something needs to be done about violence and sex on television. And violence, that's pretty straightforward what we're talking about, but there is no explicit sex on television, right, in the 1970s. So it soon becomes clear when they push for these sort of censorship rules on television, it becomes clear that sex is actually discussions about sex and discussions about sexuality. So what ends up getting censored is the stuff of All in the Family, MASH, Barney Miller, where there's talk about homosexuality, talk about abortion, contraceptions, and so forth. So you got a lot of dynamics working here in terms of Nixon and the FCC during All in the Family's heydays.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this in terms of, say, Maude, specifically to Roe versus Wade with the abortion discussion. This, these shows really feel, on the cutting edge here, pushing these conversations to a much larger, audience. I had this, so Oscar, to share with you, we come from a very poor family, my family. And so I'm born in 1977. My mother was a teenage mother. And I'm like, Mom, I had a real difficult discussion with her last year. I was like, why didn't you get an abortion? You're a teenager, She's like, well, we just didn't have, she's like, I probably wouldn't have, but we didn't even have those capabilities in, Western Kentucky. Those things just weren't available to us. And, so I think about the importance of these shows pushing this dynamic and say, that really this pushback now, as you're talking about, being played really in front of the national stage, in front of Americans' eyes here. It's like this meta conversation that's going on that I think is absolutely fascinating. And as you point out much later on, there's some parallels to Murphy Brown with Dan Quayle taking place. And I kind of wonder, do these conversations happen because All in the Family allows them the space? One show was going to open it up at some point in time, I hope. But it really feels like this show really kind of sets the stage and says, no, this is what's possible that you can do on television.
I think there's two dynamics here. And the first one is, the story of Norman Lear and how he wants to push the envelope and he wants to engage the political. And part of that is he brings in to the production company, he brings in the head of the Los Angeles National Organization for Women chapter, Virginia Carter, who is this committed feminist and living in an openly same-sex marriage or not marriage, obviously, but same-sex relationship, partnership at this time in the 1970s. And her mission is to sort of make sure that these shows, that they portray stuff in the right way, especially when it comes to portrayals of women and the women's movement and so forth, but really all controversial social political aspects are on her table. And then the other thing is make sure that this lasts more than the 30 minutes they're on the air. So make the most of this platform that you have. And so that is why, and that is how you have these, for example, the famous Maude abortion episode. It doesn't just come about sort of independently. You've got a lot of political interests and advocacy organizations working with the writers in Hollywood, but even more importantly, working with the executives at the networks to make sure that if the creatives are doing shows about about abortion, about contraceptions and so forth, that there is a green light from the headquarter in New York to actually put this on the air. And that's very important. So this is Hollywood sort of trying to get a say in political conversations. You see this also with the idea of Archie Bunker endorsing candidates, and you see it with Gene Stapleton's work for the Equal Rights Amendment later on. This is the first part of the dynamic. Hollywood wants a seat at the table. They want the power. But the other thing that sometimes is forgotten is this comes about also because politicians want something from Hollywood. They want the attention, they want the cool, they want the glitter. So that is why somebody like Richard Nixon is leaning on his friends to get Archie Bunker to endorse him. That is why you have all kinds of conversations about All in the Family in political contexts. That's why Frank Church wants to air episodes of the show in his committee meetings and so forth. They think that Hollywood and especially television entertainment can deliver voters by getting awareness and attention to the campaigns and the political movements and so forth. So it's not just, sometimes when you look at celebrity politics today, George Clooney, for example, you get this shut up and dribble almost response to that. But the reason why a George Clooney is important, or indeed, sports figures are important, is because politicians have been turning to them because they want to enjoy the benefits of, having a George Clooney introduce you at a fundraising dinner or having a connection to your basketball or baseball team or whatever we're talking about here. So it's really not just one way. It's a two-way street that brings about this weird entertainment politics that makes something like Dan Quayle beefing with a television character in the 1990s as vice president possible. And then, of course, you get the producer of Murphy Brown, Diane English, saying, you know what, we can have a debate any place, any time. And just think of, like, let's stop, Jason, here for a moment and think about that. The vice president of the United States debating a television producer about single motherhood in the U.S. What a weird concept. Quayle, of course, doesn't debate her, but they end up instead sort of taking that debate on an episode of Murphy Brown. So it really is interesting commingling, and it comes about not just because Hollywood wants a say, but because Washington or the world of politics wants to lean on the glitter and attention that Hollywood enjoys.
Yeah, I can't help but think right now that there's also, kind of peripheral to this is there's this other shark in the water. This former actor, this Ronald Reagan guy, is governor of California. Like, he's beginning his political ascendancy and very much leaning, on, he was on his career to help put, to help push that. And of course, we'll talk later on about Schwarzenegger or Trump or so forth, right? But all of this begins here. Can you talk a little bit, though? You make this really interesting point about how, Carroll O'Connor says, "Yeah, no, Richard Nixon, I'm not going to campaign for you. In fact, I'm gonna go push George McGovern in '72." That obviously they come out on the losing end of that. But can you talk about how Democratic Party politics is changed by this show post 1972?
Yeah. And that the start of that is actually O'Connor endorsing John Lindsay, the liberal mayor of New York, in the primaries. And Lindsay's campaign doesn't go anywhere. He was a Republican until like a year before the primary, which is, again, it's hard for us from today's perspective to think somebody switches parties and then a year later runs in the presidential primaries. But that's what John Lindsay does. And he has these ads with Carroll O'Connor where O'Connor really is the actor until the very last moment of these ads, where he sort of switches into the character of Archie Bunker. So he takes that cigar and he adopts the outer borough accent and sort of the malapropisms of Archie Bunker. But then in the fall campaign, McGovern's crew works with Carroll O'Connor, and in those ads, there's no the actor any longer. So Carroll O'Connor, who is like this famous liberal in Hollywood, in those ads, he says, like, I'm a conservative man, and I don't like the radicalism of the Nixon administration. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but the point is that he really completely erases the line between actor and character, because he portrays himself in that ad as Archie Bunker first and not Carroll O'Connor. And that's an interesting dynamic because it's something new. And so in terms of what, then obviously McGovern goes on to be to fail in every state except Massachusetts against Nixon, and Nixon's second term is somewhat, let's say, stunted by Watergate.
Yeah.
But you could look at this, and some historians have looked at this and be like, what a weird thing for John Lindsay. The McGovern stuff isn't that often discussed, but what a weird thing for Lindsay to think that he could sort of harness the power of a television character. But then, if you actually look at, not only did Lindsay do it, but Nixon wanted to do it, and McGovern did it, and this thinking continues after that ass whooping that McGovern got in the election, where in terms of the primaries for 1976, you get these various candidates talking about how do we get Carroll O'Connor on board. And Carroll O'Connor, not, again, the actor, because you at the same time you have this sort of, Warren Beatty is the ghost in the machine of the McGovern campaign. That's sort of the traditional showbiz politics. But they're talking about Carroll O'Connor or, the characters from McCloud or the Waltons. Like, they want these lovable characters, grumpy older men who sort of brings the security of the character more so than the appeal and glamour of Hollywood to the campaigns. Now, Jimmy Carter is not interested in this. But then,
Jimmy,
fast forward to 1980, and you got Ted Kennedy leaning again on Archie Bunker, and his aides sort of stated quite explicitly that what Archie Bunker brings to the campaign is working class credibility, which is quite amazing to hear an aide say about a fictional character, right? And indeed, it continues. Like, you even got Jerry Brown in 1992, so almost over 10 years after the show is canceled, you have him using Carol O'Connor and Rob Reiner in ads in the Democratic primaries against Bill Clinton. So it's this remarkable staying power. And it's not like it's just about All in the Family. In the 1980s, you have Bill Cosby sort of mixing his public and entertainment personas to endorse Jesse Jackson. And indeed, we saw it in not in the last election, but in the 2020 election. One of the most interesting ads, I think, that the Democrats ran was this with Wayne Knight reprising his role as Newman from Seinfeld to advocate for mail voting in the 2020 election. So you have this new way of engaging with Hollywood, that where in the book I say that even those who are uninterested in Hollywood, Jimmy Carter, for example, really hates the idea of working with Hollywood. And there's this Beverly Wilshire fundraiser where Norman Lear is in the audience, Carol O'Connor is in the audience, and Tony Randall sort of quips to Jimmy Carter, who's by then the party's candidate, that you've never met people at this level. And then Jimmy Carter is just deadpans, like, that's how I won the primaries, by not having to do with you guys. But it is interesting that somebody who doesn't respect or appreciate the role of entertainers in Hollywood, even so, he's at this dinner, at these fundraisers after his inauguration. Who shows up at the inauguration sort of extravaganza on TV? Edith and Archie Bunker. So even when you personally don't believe in this, it has, by the mid-70s, become sort of this institutionalized part of the Democratic Party coalition. And so that's why you will, in the 70s, you will have to listen if Norman Lear or Carol O'Connor calls. And that's why today, if George Clooney decides to write an op-ed, that matters.
I guess we've got to talk about it. How do we phrase this? Archie Bunker was once the most famous bigot on television, and once the most famous racist on television. Can we talk about, and this whole thing has been leading really to this intersection between politics and television. You give a lot of credit to Donald Trump in this book about his caniness to really use celebrity to position himself as maybe the success he wasn't actually in real life. Can you talk a little bit about, those dynamics to the current presidency and age, as far as because the man really seized on celebrity, and we can maybe talk about The Apprentice as, this thing here to explain where we are now in 2025. And if I'll keep my job past this podcast.
I mean, I would go even further than celebrity. I would say that he realized that the sort of division between entertainment and reality were getting erased. Because we mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier, and I think Bill Clinton is another example of this sort of cool character who recognizes sort of the media matters and performance matters, and they have this savvy relationship to how to use sound bites, how to use humor, Arsenio Hall and Bill Clinton playing the saxophone is an iconic moment in terms of celebrity politics. I'd say that Donald Trump goes further than that. It's not just a question of appearing as cool and sort of media savvy, but he realizes that what it looks is as if not more important than what it is. And this is prior even to his political career. So if you go back to the 1990s and look at Donald Trump and sort of the figure of Donald Trump, of course, the sort of tabloids in New York are an important part of how he builds his persona. But and we have that. Everybody, I think, knows that Home Alone 2 sequence in the Plaza Hotel where you have Donald Trump. But look at the sitcoms that Trump is appearing on in the 1990s as himself. We're talking about like The Nanny, Spin City, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Suddenly Susan, Drew Carey's show, Sex and the City. All of these shows, he appears as himself or not. It's labeled as himself, but I would say that it's not even himself. He appears as this successful, sort of the symbol of business success in the US, which he is not in the 1990s. And even with all of his sort of business failures, he comes off as what the television critic of the New York Times, James Ponowasek, in his book says that he's the Captain Crunch of capitalism. And I think that really gets to this point that he's this everyday symbol. And then that is what he leverages to become the sort of the host and star of The Apprentice, which again is even more messing with those boundaries, right? Because we're talking reality television, even though we today know that very little of reality television then or now has any resemblance to reality. And it's as the star of The Apprentice that he starts to pop up on right-wing radio, on Fox and Friends and stuff like this to talk about politics, which is, again, it's not just him as a television, I want to say a television character wanting to opine on political news, but it's also the fact that political news turns to a celebrity, a television character, to bring that attention to their couch and their political conversation. And that then makes it possible for him to run in 2016. And I actually think that we still don't appreciate how big of a part The Apprentice was for his successful primary campaign. How many people knew him as a business success and how important that was to his image and to their trust in him.
Can I give you a guilty confession here? We're friends now, Oscar. You and I have a lot of mutual friends. I feel like this is a safe space that I had the Donald Trump ringtone back when I was selling mortgages in the early 2000s. I'm a 20-something-year-old kid. I don't know any damn better. And he's shelling stuff and he's on The Apprentice. And I'm like, I'm buying. I'm like, yeah, I'm a worker. The phone would ring is like, this is Donald Trump. Pick up the phone, find out what they want and get back to work. And I was like, yeah, that's who I am. Bought it totally. And then, because I have no understanding who the man was at that point in time on a very personal level, right? I just know that there's this idea of success and I want to be a part of that. And I myself fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, Talking about editing, these shows are edited. Your book is edited. Are there stories from your book that didn't make the cut? Every book seems to have something in it that gets left out. Are there avenues here that you wanted to explore that you just didn't have the page count for, the things that you wanted to be able to talk about?
Most of the stuff that didn't end up in the book was actually the stuff about the actual show. So the book, if you're grabbing the book because you want to hear more about what was aired, sort of now I want to just be reminded of the conversations on the show.
Mhm.
It might be something of a disappointment because a lot of the book is actually about what happens prior and after to the broadcast. So a lot of those stories about the actual show, about the conversations on the show, those are the ones that ended up on the cutting room floor for a variety of reasons. Page count being one, but also sort of keeping the focus more clearly on these political movements around it. Um, so that's sort of that material was always the best stuff at conferences, right? Because you got to rely on Hollywood joke writers. So you got a laughter at a history conference, which always makes you feel good because it's a room full of nerds, right? That's who we are. The other part is I read and especially listened to so many oral histories about just the structure of television and the sort of network dynamics and stuff like that that I we're talking hundreds of hours that very small parts of it is in the book and most of it was just to get a better appreciation of the dynamics. So that's on the cutting room floor, so to speak, but it sort of sparked also my next project. So in that sense, I feel lucky to be able to still rely on that work.
As we kind of come to a close here, I'm kind of wondering, Oscar, we look back at this some half of a century after the film first debuted. What's in your mind the lasting legacy of All in the Family, of Archie Bunker, Norman Lear? Like when you think back on it, how should we think about this show?
I really sort of tend to agree with Phil Rosenthal, who's the producer behind Everybody Loves Raymond, for example, who said that television history can be divided into before Norman and after Norman, meaning the success of All in the Family in the 1970s. I think there is some truth to that. Um, if we're looking at like MASH, the producers of MASH, Larry Gelbart, and talked about the importance of All in the Family pushing the envelope, allowing them to go further and further. You get the same thing with producers of Mary Tyler Moore talking about like we could now do and say stuff that wasn't necessarily available to us earlier. I think this continues in soap, for example, a very, very controversial but very successful show. That's Susan Harris, who worked on All in the Family earlier. And then Golden Girls, of course, is her show as well. Again, you see sort of the roots in terms of addressing issues of importance. But it's still with us. If we look at I mean, South Park, Parker and Stone said that Cartman was intended as Archie Bunker. That's the way to sort of get Archie Bunker on the air in the 1990s was to make him a little kid. And Parks and Rec, Abbott Elementary, Superstore, which I think was a really smart show. All of these are doing stuff that is possible because of the sort of the work that All in the Family did in the 1970s. So I definitely think that television, wherever you turn almost in television, you can find traces, at least on the comedy side, you can find sort of traces that will lead you back to All in the Family. But the other thing is Norman Lear passed away almost 2 years ago now, and you could see in his in the obituaries, in the think pieces about Norman Lear, there was this sense that he was both a television producer and then later on with the People for the American Way, he was this political activist. So you saw figures like Nancy Pelosi talking about Norman Lear's legacy and so forth. And what I want to argue is that we should see this as connected because People for the American Way is this interest organization, advocacy organization that Norman Lear is able to do because of his work on All in the Family and sort of knowing that he has pushed that sort of way of talking or doing politics even during the 1970s, he has pushed that as far as he can go, and now he's moving into other form of political activism, if you will. But it's still relying on a lot of the same messages. You get these television ads, you get these television extravaganzas, and so forth. So I think Norman Lear really showed the way of moving from Hollywood into serious political activism, again, quotation marks here. And you can see the Rob Reiner's career as an example of how that works, where he goes from being this celebrated comedian to a respected film director, and then this very powerful political activist in California, in the nation, especially close with Al Gore and his presidential campaign. But even today, pushing legislation. And in fact, during the early 2000s, Rob Reiner was in many circles suggested to be the Democratic challenger to Arnold Schwarzenegger as the governor of California. So it just shows how it's possible to move from this one world to the other, because they're so closely linked, and that I argue that linkage can be found, or the starting point for that, or really the institutionalizing of that can be found in the 1970s and All in the Family.
Oscar, we've been talking about the past now for a little over an hour. What's in your future? Now you've got this amazing book out. It's done. What next? What comes next for you?
Well, so next for me, I'm working on a project that is, again, television and politics, but it's turning the lens to television news. So it's studying how politics, and especially how Congress shaped television news in the 1960s and 1970s. Sort of an attempt to look beyond Nixon to understand television news. And especially a key part of that project is looking beyond just the networks and looking at how these local affiliates are handling television news, and especially the connections between Congress, the local, and the networks. So that's my current project, and I'm hoping to continue with. I mean, for me, this connection, or all of these connections between politics and mass media, are really what I find perhaps the most interesting in the political scene in the U.S. And I think a lot of the negatives in terms of present day U.S. politics we can also trace back to this idea that, politics isn't a participatory process so much as a spectator sport, where you have the red team and you have the blue team, and you talk about this as if it's a constant race between the two, and then nothing really matters beyond how does this impact the next race, or the polling numbers for the next race, and so forth. And in fact, having sort of the distance watching this from Finland, from the Nordics, it becomes really clear that a lot of coverage of the US over here, but also a lot of conversations about the US, is really a form of spectator sport watching. You have, that old line of put on the popcorn is very heavily influencing the conversations here, because beyond foreign policy, there's a sense that we're not living with the stakes, so we can just watch a shutdown as a fight between Democrats and Republicans and don't have to care about the actual human lives that are impacted. So I think that again, can be traced not just to television entertainment, but I think also other parts of television news, campaign reporting, and stuff like that. So I'm always here to say that media matters, and especially political media matters.
Well, buddy, I have one thought on that, which is, for you out there, don't give up on us. But two, I have had the best time talking to you. Reading this book was fascinating. Getting to spend time and thought with you, thinking about this incredible piece of American pop culture, but also American political history. Now that we go back and think about where this show fits in, I found this completely fascinating, Oscar, and I am so thankful to you for coming in and talking to me today from across the pond, just a little bit. So thank you so very much for stopping in. This was so much fun.
Jason, thank you so much, both for having me on and for your kind words.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Oscar Winberg, for coming in and talking to us today about this amazing show and this amazing book that he just wrote, Archie Bunker for President, How One Television Show Remade American Politics. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you, of course, to all of you for continuing to support the podcast, for sharing it with your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, your enemies, whoever, right? Thank you all for being here. We have a ton more pods coming for you. So keep listening, and we'll talk to you then. Ciao for now. Bye.